make it clear.
Order.
I did not make the comment.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are our evolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. She is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, one of the best bloggers in New Zealand, Phoebe Fletcher. And he is a former Green Party MP, well-known social justice activist and political commentator, Keith Locke. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, has the Waitangi Tribunal forced the National Party to slow down? Issue 2, isn't it time to allow gay adoption and gay marriage? And Issue 3 tonight, MP John Baggs is off the hook for any charges on donations, but does the law need an overhaul? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. The Waitangi Tribunal looks to have put the asset sale program on hold with their ruling that Māori need to be heard by September before the government push ahead with share sales. Phoebe, has the language by John Key here surprised you? Last month it was all, I can do what I like and ignore everyone. This month it's all due process and I'm listening.
It hasn't surprised me at all, and I think this is something that we were saying all along, is that we are in the realm here of constitutional law. So the bolshiness that we saw immediately by Key, I think he's begun to have a bit of a realisation of the legal implications. And I think people like Mai Chen, for example, who's a constitutional law expert, has been very good on this. For example, talking about the 1987 lands case and the way that that led to the 1988 SOE Act. So, you know, there are legal precedents here, and I do believe that John Key has to, you know, he has to be a lot more careful than he initially was. But I think one of the things or strategies that he may be been adopting was really to, I guess, rile that Pākehā white voting base, so that you've got a bit of a backlash against Māori that is going to pave the way for those asset sales. But you know,
always helps to bash Māori a little bit when they want something.
But, you know, this has really damaged the relationship with Māori Council. This has also really damaged the relationship, one could argue, with the Waitangi Tribunal, releasing their interim report saying that, that the sale should be delayed until a full report is released. You know, this is an area where he does need to be very careful because, you know, there is the capacity there for compensation claims.
Keith, the positive media coverage over the Māori Party's so-called concession not to legislate and the idea that this wouldn't slow the asset sale process were all given as quite clear mainstream memes, and they've all been wrong. Have the media been blindsided because they lack a Māori perspective?
I think so. The reporting on Māori issues is still a bit ghettoised, really. There's the Māori media, and then the representation in the main media is still inadequate. And the issues that the Māori case brings up are issues that go beyond Māoridom. What we do with water, you know, it isn't just how we produce power. It's what we, you know, there's within the producing power, there's these big dams around the country, you know, how we use the water in our major rivers. And that is something, well, we can see it in the United States now with the big drought, that, you know, how water is used and shortages of water are very important to the whole community and will be increasingly important. So working out how to deal with them in a long-term sense, involving Māori, involving the community, and it's something that can be much easier done if you don't privatise your major users of water, that is the power companies.
Do you think that by having a lack of perspective from the Māori world in their coverage, do you think that actually adds to the backlash a lot of Pākehā feel? If you talk to the average Pākehā about this issue, they sold it as an issue of Māori are trying to take water. Do you think that's a negative?
I think it's a bit different from the foreshore and seabed. You know, this whole thing, you know, we won't be able to walk on a beach was sort of used by the anti or more racist element of society to oppose what Māori were asking on the foreshore and seabed. I don't think it's got quite the same impact this time because I think most people realise when you're dealing with water, there's a whole lot of factors. Māori do perhaps have some relationship there. something important to say, something important to do. So I don't think there's going to be quite the same backlash this time.
Is it because it's an asset sale? Does that add to the inclusiveness of the issue for a lot of people?
I think so, because there's such a huge opposition to asset sales in general, and particularly ones that have been built up over the generations. And we always thought that, you know, our parents and their generation bequeathed these major power stations to us.
That's right, that's right. Phoebe, Fran O'Sullivan's extraordinary column this week, where she refers to a business mindset that describes iwi input into resources as brown mail instead of black mail, does highlight the danger for John Key, that any extra sweeteners for iwi will be backlashed by National's own rump vote, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it does. And I mean, I guess carrying on from what Keith was saying there, that it doesn't seem to have the same kind of element of riling the general public as the foreshore and seabed issue. I think there still are elements of that here. I mean, Sue Abel, Dr. Sue Abel at Auckland University has done a lot of work on this. She's written a book called Reading the Media, Waitangi Day in the News, where she, looks into what are the reasons behind the way that we react to Māori issues. And if you look at media, by and large, it is targeted towards people with disposable incomes. Now, Māori are a group that are not seen as having a lot of disposable income. And, so when you're looking at things like the news, it is really targeting, it's your lost leader that you spend a lot of money on so that you can keep people carrying on that channel for the night. So it's going to reflect the dominant ideologies, and I think that also due to the time constraints and perhaps the knowledge constraints of journalists as well. I mean, these are deeper issues that need a lot more investigation. It's really easy to fall back to those kind of hot button issues. But yeah, I think Fran O'Sullivan's column is, reflecting the perspective of a particular portion within the business community, and that also is political. I think you have to argue that there is, there are political reasons behind the way that is being positioned.
I think that, like all this talk that John Key goes on about mum and dad investors and how they're going to have this great stake in the power assets.
That's right.
How many mum and dad investors are there amongst the Māori population in Kaikoui, for example?
And
they're just not thinking about that at all. So it's a debate that's going over the top of them.
But I guess my point was that it's quite clear that sometimes these things are not intentional. It's just a matter of being immersed in a particular kind of ideology and not being able to see the other side of the story. And we have a long history of that in New Zealand when it comes to Māori stories.
Keith, the economic case of selling assets was always difficult because it will cost us more than keeping them. By increasing loyalty sweeteners to the 5% who will buy shares on top of holding aside shares for possible Māori iwi compensation, does the economics behind the asset sale become even more questionable now?
There's pluses and minuses from a simple economic point of view with these reward shares or bonus shares. Some people have argued that it will result in more take-up of smaller investors, etc., etc. I can't really judge one way or the other on that. They may have an argument. The larger issue is should they be partially privatised at all, because when you put them in more of a commercial model, we could see this with the Auckland Port and where that led us. You're looking for short-term gains, whereas with our power companies, you shouldn't be looking for short-term gains for the power companies. These are major infrastructures, and you should be looking at long-term investment, sometimes in renewables, costing a lot of research and money and that sort of thing, and not just looking at a short-term return for investors.
Question to both of you. If the High Court action delays the first asset sales, I mean, is this good news for the 200,000 New Zealanders who signed up to the referendum at the moment that maybe the referendum will be held before the first asset sale?
I think it is good news if it does delay it as we think it may, because they've got 200,000 signatures already. They've got until May next year to get the full amount. So I think that is going to place increasing political pressure.
Are we going to see more political pressure if the referendum can start before the first asset sale?
I think so, yes. If the referendum really gets underway and there's 400,000 signatures, it just shows that there's a whole momentum then in the community to talk about this issue and how's it going to determine my vote next election, and that might make the national government very scared.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, isn't it time to allow gay adoption and gay marriage? Phoebe, this ongoing discrimination against homosexuals to marry or adopt should be a source of national cringe and embarrassment, shouldn't it?
I think it is, but I think, what's really interesting to me, I guess, over this whole debate is that, politically there are very few parties that want to endorse going against it. I mean, if you look at the Labour MPs and National MPs that have been interviewed, you've had this kind of efficiency line that, where they haven't wanted to come out against it and they've said, look, I'm far too busy to read the legislation, I've got asset sales on my mind, which I think is a convenient way of trying not to offend a group of voters. But I have to say, I have to congratulate John Key for coming out and saying that he will vote for the bill.
Yep.
I mean, I think this is something that we need to look at. We do have civil unions. Obviously, civil unions are not quite the same status as marriage when it comes to, for example, people moving overseas or, the ability to adopt. And I think that, the fact that it looks like this bill might scrape through tells us that, as a culture at the moment, the majority of New Zealanders are not actually that threatened by gay marriage.
Keith, are Christians who claim to have invented marriage like Americans who have claimed to have invented democracy? Can Christians and the Christian right in New Zealand really hold ownership of marriage up as the justification not to redefine it?
I don't think so. I think it's a fundamental human rights issue, and I'm very pleased actually the way I think the New Zealand community's moved. It's part of what's happening around the world, around the Western world anyhow.
Yep.
I think President Obama's stand in favour of it was sort of the tipping point in a certain sense. But I was in Parliament when we had the big debate over civil unions, and it was, quite a knock-down, drag-out fight that one. And I think that even though there's quite a few National Labour MPs umming and ahhing, I think the bill is going to get through quite easily, and I think the adoption might follow in its wake, same-sex couples being able to adopt. And, I think they'll be very positive and maybe influence the debate in Australia too, where it's only really the Greens in Australia that are pushing for it.
That's
and
right.
Even Labor's very dicey on the whole issue over there. So, and I think we're advancing as a community. You see, sometimes these sort of celebrity magazines, an indication of it, and they have Alison Moe and her partner and David Farrier and his partner and TV stars, and it's more acceptable now, even though there's quite a lot of underlying prejudice in New Zealand that's still got to be dealt with. I think the momentum is quite positive at the present time.
Phoebe, two narratives. The first is that John Key is showing real leadership on this issue by supporting it. The second narrative by John Armstrong at the Herald says Key is supportive to moderate political perceptions after a spasm of Benny bashing. Which narrative is correct?
I think, he was reticent at first, but I think...
Didn't support civil unions?
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that, and there is like a debate over whether, for example, it will be Colin Craig and the Conservative Party with their Christian base that come through next as a possible coalition partner. So I think that there is an element of that. But yeah, in this instance, I would like to congratulate him for coming forward. And, I do think that, as Keith was saying, that there has been a change in our society, and this change has been, I guess, since we've had real advances on women's issues, that women have much more ability to have choice and partnership. And we've seen that kind of changes in that traditional family structure. I mean, even if you look at our young people today, they're not having, women aren't having babies until later. Yeah. So I think people are much more, I guess, flexible around the model of the family and the notion that, it's a happy family that makes happy children, really, rather than, an enforced kind of heterosexual coupling. So, I think there is a bit of political posturing there, certainly with, a lot of the other national MPs. I mean, they do have, some Christian base as well. But, then again, not all Christians are against gay marriage. It's important to point out.
And the sort of morally conservative parties haven't done very well in New Zealand.
That's right,
since
to date.
To date. The first MMP election, they got about 4.3% or something like that. But beyond that, all of the ones that have set up the Pacific Party, Kiwi Party, you name them.
Having pedophiles as leaders can't help.
They've all sort of pretty much been marginalised.
Yes.
And so I don't think... I think Colin Craig will find that. He's got a lot of money, sure, but I think he'll find that.
His Facebook page at the moment is hilarious. Yes. He's just getting trolled, by people that are pretending to be anti it.
But just on that Conservative Party, if the MMP threshold is lowered to 4%, which is certainly where the momentum is going at the moment for 2014, Does this debate empower the Conservative Party? Could they be a real power broker in 2014?
It is, 4% threshold would make it easier, but I think you're still struggling to get above 3% if you're a morally conservative party, because people don't vote on that. Even though there's quite a few people who have conservative morals, they don't necessarily vote on that issue. They vote on broader issues and will vote Labour, National, Greens, etc.
So you don't see the Conservative Party as a rising power?
No, I don't think it's really going to go much further than it did in the past.
Okay. Question to both of you. Will gay marriage and gay adoption get passed before the end of this term?
I'm not sure about gay adoption, but gay marriage, I think that will get through.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think gay adoption, would require really either the bill to be pulled from the ballot, there's one there, I think, or more than one, or the government to really take it up, and probably the government won't take it up. Again, it might, this question of are we going to alienate a few people then starts to come into play, and the government probably leave it on to the next parliament, perhaps we'll talk about it type of thing.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, Epsom MP John Banks is off the hook for any charges on donations, but does the law need an overhaul? Phoebe, the police report was hardly an endorsement for innocence, was it? The donation laws are a joke, aren't they?
They are a joke. The police report was actually quite hilarious. The notion that he was getting staffers to process for donations, and therefore he didn't know that it had been entered as anonymous, even though he had been quite clearly soliciting these donations. But just getting somebody else to process it, I think it is a joke, and I think it will be looked at. But I think it is an awkward position for the key government. I mean, there was, an extensive amount of media at that time over the banks.com scandal. I mean, it didn't help that he took on someone with such a international profile behind him that was kind of a hot button issue at the moment. I mean, Banks, it has really marred his, his reputation. And I think that it is something that should be looked at.
Keith, how important is donation law? It seems very dry. Seems like something you really don't want to get your teeth into. But how important is it for a functioning democracy?
Oh, very important. Otherwise, people buy elections. We've had Electoral Finance Act, all kinds of debates in Parliament on it, and some progress has been made, and more progress needs to be made in terms of lowering the thresholds for the amount of money you have to declare.
Because a lot of cash gets laundered into those anonymous numbers, doesn't it?
Through trusts, as with the Auckland Mayoralty, where I think both candidates had about $500,000. I've got the exact figures going through trusts. But I think the police got it wrong, because to me, and I had a look at the Act, that if there's a requirement for you to actually accurately state your donations, then if you don't do that,
was
you're
it because
breaching
of the 6
the law.
month? Was it the 6 month time
Well,
frame?
whether or not there's a complaint, they said, it was beyond the 6 month threshold for complaints. But the other question they said, what was put across, was even though he signed it, somebody else prepared the document, so therefore he didn't have responsibility. Now, if you apply, that can't be true, because why do you sign anything? And the whole idea is the candidate has to declare, not the candidate's flunky. And you're responsible for your signature unless you have a good reason that it's something highly technical that you couldn't really understand. There was nothing of that nature in this. It was clear, big donations that John Banks knew about. And had, I don't think he had a case to get off, and I think the police were wrong in their judgment.
But perhaps it was a 16-month technicality, because, if a legal case was brought forward, then that might become an issue. So,
question to both of you. Labour have no moral high ground here, do they, in terms of lecturing Key about not sacking or moving on Banks because of Philip Field, do they?
No, well, they don't really. I mean, this is the thing, and this is Keith's point, is that we do need, this legislation in place, because it is important for the transparency around all parties. Where there are loopholes, they will be exploited, and it is very important for us to know who is donating to our politicians.
Philip Field completely robs Labour of any moral high ground to lecture Key on, doesn't it?
Yeah, unless they say, well, it wasn't our fault, but it was just Philip Field.
But they kept him on, and they kept his number. They kept him on when it was looking. They should have. Because
said-
he's not going to move John Banks on because he needs John Banks's vote, right?
Yeah, well, that's the guts of the whole
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
There's a one-vote majority, and they can't rely on the Maori Party for a lot of their more
No.
right-wing legislation. So,
How important is Holly's bill to get a register of lobbyists so we know who's going in there and putting money in people's pockets?
yeah, I think it is important, particularly with the big lobbyists. It's
Yep.
a bill around paid lobbyists,
Yep.
not every voluntary organisation,
Yep.
small organisation that doesn't have paid staff doing this.
Mm.
It's really directed at the big money bags lobbyists. You know, there's a whole industry of them in places like America, and we don't want that developing more here. And the ones that have these free cards to get in and out of Parliament now are mainly the big lobbying
That's right,
firms,
that's right.
along with the CTU and whatnot.
Who
But-
should have it
Yeah.
left? Great final question to both of you on this. Will Don Brash be eyeing up another coup on the ACT Party? Come on, you know that old dog loves the game, loves it.
There might be a difference in the perception of what goes on in his head versus what might happen in reality. I mean, come
John
on,
Banks
he
is
ran
pretty
that
damaged,
party
isn't
into
he?
the ground.
Well,
in terms of
has
a
Banks
vote.
gone further?
Yeah, Banks is pretty much there too.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I don't think,
You don't think
Don
so?
Brash would be a great look for ACT. Yeah.
Nothing. Well, surely something would be better than John Banks.
Well, I think they're at a loss, aren't they? In terms of their last conference, what do
Yeah.
they have, 80 people, and quite
Yeah.
a lot of discussion about this, like how do we drag ourselves back out of all of these political disasters,
Yep.
but certainly not Don Brash.
Would Don Brash just be the cherry on the cake? Cherry on the top of the
I
cake?
think he's too busy running around the world or solving the world economic
Oh,
crisis.
that's right. He keeps getting phone calls and sent
and,
overseas, doesn't he?
Yes, he's the man to solve
The go-to man on this
everything. You know, like
collapse of free market capitalism.
Yeah.
You don't think he's going to take a shot again? Because there are rumours about John Banks being forced to step down as the leader of the
you
party.
can't rule it out because his coup
Is that crazy?
previously was so silly and
Yeah.
humorous in a sense
Yeah.
that anything could happen. But
Well, let's hope. Let's wrap this show. Phoebe, your final word this week is?
Well, speaking of, people that have been tarnished politically, I mean, it's going to be interesting, the launch of the structure for the charter schools, or what we're now calling partnership schools
Partnership
today.
schools, yeah.
That will be rolled out in 2014. Of course, that's launched by Minister for Education, Heke Parata, who has had a bit of a rough time recently with the class numbers, and Associate Minister for Education, John Banks.
That's the duo of doom, surely.
It is the duo of doom. But, what's really quite interesting, released today, and we've already got the New Zealand Education Institute out on the bat for that, because it looks like, there may be provisions for unregistered teachers
That's
and the
incredible,
legislation
isn't it?
coming through. So I guess that would be my final word, is watch this space. I mean, there's a lot of debates around charter schools.
Yep.
It's going to be really interesting to see how the pilot ones run. I mean, they've invested a lot of money in it, isn't it?
Yes.
$100,000 salary for, looking after the first charter schools that get rolled out. So I think this is something that, parents and teachers should be watching very closely.
People should have experience with education, surely, before they're
I
running
think so.
before they're running schools, surely.
Absolutely.
Keith, your final word this week?
well, we've got to have an Olympic element to the show,
Yes,
and I've
yes.
enjoyed watching the Olympics, and it's the world community all sort
Yep.
of watching wonderful sport. But I do get worried about the intrusion of business, where the 5-ring Olympic
Yes,
symbol,
yes.
which is an expression of that world community, the 5 continents, everyone together, has been sort of expropriated. And
Sordid.
no little dairy in London can use the 5 rings without being prosecuted because they're not a major sponsor putting so many $1 billion in.
Yes.
And of course, these sponsors have got these, half the stadium seem to be put aside for the sponsors and their flunkies.
That's right.
And then they never turn up. And
Too busy
what
at the
could
cocktail
be a
parties.
better illustration of that? And you look at the pictures and there's all troops being brought in to sit in the seats. And
yeah.
of course, that would make the North Korean sports team pretty happy, but
Yes.
they
else
feel
is.
at home. But it does seem rather strange. And yeah, I just find it, and I just don't like the super patriotism of the Olympics. Like,
Yeah.
why not just knock the anthems on the head for a start? Like, it's good having a bit of pride in how your people do, and the New Zealanders winning medals and all the rest of it. But I get sick of hearing the Chinese and American anthems all the time and all this hand on the heart stuff. Tone that down a bit.
Interesting also Sky TV and Prime TV's coverage. Prime TV free to air because interestingly they were given the free to air rights and the paid rights. Sky Prime 45 minutes longer because of the adverts they put into it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. John Banks's crocodile tears over donation reforms are an audacity too far. Are we really going to put up with this political shiver looking for a spine telling us he wants to reform the law after he has been caught out soliciting and taking donation money that's supposed to be anonymous? Come on. It's bad enough Banks has misled with untruths, but to now have to put up with his attempt to transform himself into a reformer is transsexual political surgery gone awry. John Banks cannot fall any lower in political standing because he's at rock bottom. Nothing short of a homicidal rampage through a solo parent kindergarten is going to damage John Banks' credit rating with voters because it's already at 0. It's hilarious that Banks was supposed to be brought in to be the Don Brash stain remover. He's managed that not by removing Don's stain, but by causing a massive new stain that blots out Don's. When will Brash challenge for the ACT Party leadership again? If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget, my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on